What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be finishing off our tank series with the Sorcerer tank. So the Sorc tank has definitely seen a couple of changes to some of their abilities over the past few patches, and is actually not that bad of a tank now due to these changes. They still don't match up to DKs or Warden tanks in terms of overall group utility, but in terms of survivability, I'd argue that Sorc tanks are actually one of the better tanks out there, mainly because of bound armaments and the additional block reduction that it gives to Sorc tanks. However, like I mentioned, in general, DKs and Wardens do have greater group utility, so you're going to be hard-pressed to find Sorc tanks at the very high-end levels of play in PvE, but nonetheless, Sorc tanks are definitely able to tank through pretty much all the content in the game in the right hands. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, basically everything you need to know to recreate this build yourself. Now as a support role, you do need to have a lot of different skills and a lot of different sets to have on hand to kind of fit the situation, whether that's a specific trial, a specific fight, or even just a specific group and the way that they're doing a specific boss fight. So we'll be going over all of the most common skills and sets that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. Now, of course, tanks don't have a DPS parse, so we won't be doing any sort of dummy parsing. Instead, I'll kind of discuss briefly about the philosophy of tanking, how tanking is different in ESO compared to other MMOs, and how Sorc tanks differ from other classes in their tanking style. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So this is just one of many different possible gear combinations that you're going to want to have as a Sorc tank, and I will be touching upon all the different gear that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. Starting off first with Monster Helm. Lord Warden is always a safe bet to go for when it comes to Monster Helms on tanks. It is both selfish and group oriented. So the one piece just adds a couple of spell resistance and physical resistance to you, almost 3,000 each. And then the two piece gives 3870 spell and physical resistance to everybody within 8 meters of you when it procs. This does stack with things like Major Ward and Major Resolve, so pretty nice boost to overall survivability, especially for stack and burn fights. It's not going to be the best Monster Helm in all situations, but it is still a very classic Monster Helm set that is used in both progression groups and in endgame groups alike. Moving on to our body sets. So our first set is going to be Ebon Armory. This is a base game set from Crypt of Hearts, one of the strongest support sets in the game that a tank can wear for their group. It increases max health by 1118 for you and up to 11 group members and 28 meters of you. This is affected by CPs and other percentage modifiers, so it actually ends up being closer to between 1.4 to 1.6k additional health, which actually is pretty useful. It basically allows your DPS to spec a little bit more heavily into pure damage rather than having to focus in kind of making up for survivability. So pretty strong set to wear as a tank. Our next set is going to be Perfected Yolnahkriin. So this comes from Elsweyr, the new trial Sun Spire. The perfect version comes from the vet version of the trial. It doesn't have to be hard mode, just has to be on vet. The non-perfect version drops from normal Sun Spire. The difference between the two sets, non-perfect and perfect, is that additional max health there. So not a big deal if you can't get the perfected version. The non-perfect version is pretty much just as strong. Max health is not really that big of an issue. It's not hard to get additional max health as a tank, so don't feel like you have to get the perfect version in order to run the set here. The other 5-piece, that minor courage bonus, that remains the same across both perfect and non-perfect versions, and that's really why you're wearing Yolnahkriin there. We're still going sword and board on the front bar and either an ice staff, lightning staff, or bow on the back bar depending on the specific needs of the group. Frost Staff will give you the most amount of mitigation because of the additional block passives through Ancient Knowledge. The Lightning Staff helps out with off-balance uptime, and the Bow is there if you also want to do additional DPS, kind of as an off DPS, off-tank kind of role there. All three do have the full strength of their enchants, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose. Again, adapt to your group's needs. In terms of traits and enchants here, for your back bar, pretty much Infused Crusher is your stereotypical go-to for any tank in a group environment here. Infused to help boost your Crusher enchant. Other potential enchants are going to basically be just a shock damage enchant, and if you want to play more selfish, absorb health, absorb magicka, or absorb stamina. Infused is pretty much going to be the best option for your back bar. You could run something like defending if you would like, but generally speaking, Infused is going to be the best trait for your back bar because you do want to take advantage of the full strength enchant on the back bar weapon. On your front bar, we are going with poisons, so you have a few options when it comes to poison. You can use fracturing poisons, breaching poisons, drain stamina poisons, drain health poisons. You have a couple of different options out there. And that's mainly because on the one-hander, you have half strength enchant, so they're not particularly strong. Of course, you could still run enchant, so like an absorb stamina, absorb magicka, hardening, anything like that, shock glyph even, but it's not going to be quite as strong as the enchant on your back bar. So if you are going with enchants, then you can go with Infused on the front bar there, just to give your enchants a little bit more of a bump there. Otherwise, if you're running poisons, you might as well stick with Decisive. None of the traits are really particularly good if you're running poisons, but Decisive probably gives you the most utility overall, just gives you some additional chance to generate some more ultimate, so it gives you better Warhorn uptime. For jewelry, I personally like to go 2 Triune and 1 Harmony. I like Harmony for additional sustain I get from using orbs or shards, plus the additional healing I get from things like the Purify synergy, the Blood Altar synergy, and so on. But Harmony is not particularly strong, or at least not seen as very strong by a lot of endgame tanks here. So this is my personal preference. Other traits include Triune, like I mentioned earlier, for all across the board good stats. You can also just go with just raw stats and do a single stat, so robust, arcane, healthy, depending on what stat you want to focus in on. Or you can go with Infused to get some more bonuses out of your enchants. For your enchants, you basically have 3 options. What I like the most are going to be shield plate enchants. This just reduces the cost of block, giving you a little bit more stamina sustain. Other options include the magicka regen glyph, which basically helps boost your magicka regen. It allows you to use more of your buffing abilities, because a lot of our buffing abilities do end up using magicka. It's a little bit less so on Sorks. Sork tanks, generally speaking, have a little bit more stamina abilities than other tanks, but some of your self-heals, for instance, does use magicka, so you just want to make sure you have good amounts of magicka there. So that's why magicka regen glyphs are pretty useful there. The third enchant is going to be the potion cooldown glyphs. Don't really see it being used very often on non-Argonian tanks. It's mostly the Argonians that are running these glyphs. They basically reduce the cooldown of your potion by 5 seconds. So if you have 3 potion cooldown glyphs instead of 45 seconds between potions, it's going to be 30 seconds. It's why it's useful on Argonian tanks. Well, Argonians get 4,000 health, magicka, and stamina back whenever they drink a potion. So reducing the cooldown between potions basically allows you to drink more potions, which increases your overall sustain. However, because you're drinking more potions, it does end up being very expensive to maintain those potion cooldown glyphs. So just keep that in mind if you decide to go with those glyphs there. For traits and enchants on your armor pieces, there are a couple of schools of thoughts. So starting off with the traits, there's really 2 schools of thoughts. The first one is go all sturdy on all of your pieces, which is perfectly fine. It helps out your block sustain, just reduces the cost of your block by a really decent amount. The other option, which is the school that I kind of prescribe to, is sturdy on the small pieces and then infuse on the large pieces. In terms of enchants, again, 2 schools of thoughts. There's the prismatics on your large pieces, and then use your small pieces to kind of play around with health, stamina, and magicka to figure out what resource pools are right for you. Alternatively, you can just go all prismatic enchants, just make it really, really simple, and just maximize all of your resources at once. Those are the various schools of thoughts when it comes to traits and enchants on your armor. And that does also include your shield. Most people prefer to go sturdy on the shield with prismatic, but there is an argument for infused for more resources, as well as reinforced and Nirntone for some more resistances as well. Reinforced and Nirntone are also potential options for your chest and legs, but it's not particularly hard to get the resistance cap in this game, so it's generally speaking not all that useful to run Reinforced or Nirntone on your large armor pieces. Moving on to our other sets. So we'll be going over these in relatively alphabetical order here, so just bear with me while we go over all the different sets. So there's a lot of sets in the game you want to have on hand, depending on the trial, depending on the fight, depending on what strategies your team might be using. So starting off first here with dungeon sets, there's a handful of dungeon sets you're going to want to have on hand. We already talked about Ebon, which comes from Crypt of Hearts. Other sets include Leeching Plate. This is more selfish. This is more if you want the additional heal. So this comes from Imperial City Prison, so you do have access to the Imperial City DLC. And this basically, whenever you take damage, you have a chance to summon a cloud of poison under whatever damage you do, which deals a certain amount of poison damage and heals you for the same amount of damage that you caused. Really, really great for trash pulls where you need the additional healing. Really, really strong in, for example, Black Rose Prison. But beyond that, doesn't really provide any sort of group utility, so this is more for self-healing, sort of more selfish set. Next we have Jail's Tenacity, also a relatively selfish set, so whenever you lose 7,000 or more health in a single attack, you gain Major Vitality for 5 seconds. So this is really kind of nice to have in progression groups, because if you're taking more than 7,000 points of damage in a single attack, chances are you do need additional healing. So good examples of where this is very useful is going to be in Cloud Risk to help combat Baneful Mark, and potentially even in Sunspire to kind of combat all the dragons that are hitting you in hard mode in particular. But pretty strong set overall, but again, it's more selfish, not really overall group utility involved in running this set here. Moving on next to overland sets, there's a handful of overland sets that you also want to pick up here. So starting off here, on the very top, you have Plague Doctor, another classic selfish set. This comes from Deshawn. Just adds straight up max health. Really, really nice for progression, but once you get out of progression, you kind of want to move towards more group-oriented sets. Moving on, you have Akaviri Dragonguard, which reduces the cost of your ultimate abilities by 15%. Another base game set from Eastmarch. Sorcs already have 50% cost reduction to the ultimate, so your Warhorns already cost 213 ultimate. This additional 15% drops it down even further, so this gives you very, very fast Warhorns up climb. So really, really strong on Sorc tanks to just become a total ultimate battery, just a complete Warhorn battery that way. Moving on, I do want to mention Livewire, which is pretty useful for the AoE concussion, which is necessary to apply off balance to enemies. Not particularly strong heal as well. I should say it is a strong heal as well. So you heal for 1150 health for each enemy hit. So it kind of combines the effects of Leeching Plate with a little bit of group utility by applying Concussed. The downside is it does have an 8-second cooldown, so just kind of keep that in mind. But it's really, really strong on trash pulls, so a lot of groups like to have this on hand for trash pulls, not just in dungeons, but also in trials as well. In terms of trial sets, there's not really that many good heavy armor trial sets that you can pick up. Obviously, there's Claw of Yolnahkriin, which we already talked about, but the only other one that you might want to consider picking up is going to be Eternal Warrior, in those instances where you might want to run it for like no death achievements, if you're comfortable running Death Preventer sets for no death achievements. But beyond that, none of the heavy sets, aside from Claw of Yolnahkriin, are actually very useful on a tank at all. So don't really bother trying to farm these heavy armor sets in trials. There's also one crafted set that I also want to mention here that you might want to have on hand as a tank, and that's going to be Torug's Pact, which is a base game set. It requires 3 traits in order to craft this, and this basically increases your weapon enchant potency by 30% and reduces the cooldown by 30% as well. So this is mainly for that Crusher enchant on the back bar. If you're not running the Crusher enchant, then you're not going to be wearing Torug's Pact. Sometimes healers will be responsible for Crusher, and so Torug's Pact goes out to the healer rather than the tank. So it's going to be really a play by ear, kind of see which strategy your group decides to go for, whether it's going to be on the tank or on the healer. Moving on to Monster Helm sets, there's quite a few Monster Helm sets that you want to have on hand. Starting off from the very top here, moving our way down. First one is going to be Earthgore. So Earthgore has been nerfed for PvE as of Elsweyr, so instead of healing everybody within the proc area, it's only the lowest health person in the area. That being said, Earthgore will always proc when you need it, so it will only proc when somebody is under 50% health, and it does proc on yourself. So in certain fights, Earthgore is still pretty strong to have on a tank. So for Cloud Rest, for example, to help combat Baneful Mark on yourself, Earthgore is actually pretty nice. So very niche uses now for Earthgore compared to how it was prior to Elsweyr, but in those niche uses, it's still quite strong. Moving on, there's Bloodspawn, which comes from Spindle Clutch 2. This is probably the only base game tank Monster Helm set that's actually pretty decent. So whenever you take damage, you have a chance to generate 14 ultimate and increase your physical and spell resistance by 6450 for 6 seconds. Really not going to be using this for the resistances. This is definitely more for the ultimate generation to get the ultimate battery going in order to get that Warhorn up as a Sorc tank. So not particularly useful for resistances, definitely very strong if your sole job is to generate as many Warhorns as you possibly can. Next we have Thurvokun. This comes from Fang Lairs, who do not have access to the Dragonguard DLC. Whenever you take damage, you basically summon a pool of Growing Bile for 8 seconds, which deals a certain amount of disease damage and inflicts minor maim and minor defile. Really great for an AoE minor defile, minor maim I should say, which really helps out group survivability. Sorc tanks don't have a native source of minor maim outside of heroic slash, so having Thurvokun and trash pulls is really nice, especially for progression groups, where ad pulls can actually be a little bit more dangerous than actual boss fights themselves. Next we have Vykosa, which comes from Moonhunter Keep, so you have access to the Wolf Hunter DLC to grab this set. So when you bash an enemy that you've taunted, you frighten them with a deafening howl, applying major maim to them for 3 seconds. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds. So using Vykosa to its maximum effect does require you to basically have advanced knowledge of the fight. You need to know what attacks you can use this on. So for example, Lothus's Defiling Blast, you can use this on the Warrior's Thousand Cuts, you can use this on Sunspire Dragon Breaths. So you do need to have a little bit of advanced knowledge when it comes to when to use Vykosa, but when you do use it, it's pretty much a major maim on demand, which can really help out group survivability or your own survivability. So definitely a set I would recommend picking up if you're in this sort of progression style group. Next we have Stonekeeper, which is pretty much a solely selfish tank monster helm set. So this comes from Frostbolt, so you do have access to Wrathstone. Symphony of Blades is another monster helm set from Depths of Maltar, which you will also need Wrathstone to get. So Stonekeeper, the one piece, is pretty interesting and unique in the fact that it's pretty much a prismatic enchant, so you get all 3 resources. 2-piece, when you block an attack, you gain an energy charge stack up to 1 stack per second. When you gain 6 charges, you release the energy, restoring 5350 stamina and magicka and healing for the same amount. After releasing the charges, you cannot regain new charges for 14 seconds. So this basically gives it a 20-second cooldown, and if you decide to work out the math, it ends up being quite a bit of additional sustain. So on a 20-second cooldown, it ends up being the equivalent of about 535 additional combat regen based on the stamina, magicka, and healing that you get. Healing is going to be a little bit higher because it is affected by healing done and healing received modifiers. So really, really great for selfish in situations where you need additional sustain, but beyond that doesn't provide any sort of group utility. Then Symphony of Blades, when you heal an ally who's under 50% of their primary resource, you grant them Meridia's Favor, restoring 23-25 magicka or stamina, whichever max is higher every second for 6 seconds. This effect can occur every 18 seconds. You cannot progress on yourself, unfortunately, so you can't get Meridia's Favor yourself, but you can get it from other people running Symphony of Blades. This is mostly used to help support your DPS rather than yourself. So if you wear this set, you can pretty much give resources to your DPS or maybe your off tank perhaps, which really helps boost your overall sustain. When you take into consideration the amount of resources you get back with the cooldown, ends up being around 770 resource returns, which is quite per second, which is actually quite strong. So if you think about it in terms of combat regen, that's an additional almost 1500 additional regen per combat regen, so either magicka regen or stamina regen. Really strong for sustain both in 4-man and 12-man content, and it really shines when you have multiple people running Symphony of Blades here. Moving on to a character sheet. So I am a Nord. Nords are considered to be one of the best races for tanking. Now for tanking itself, race doesn't really make that big of a difference as compared to like on a DPS. Pretty much any race in the game can tank all the content in the game fairly decently well. It's more about knowledge behind mechanics and knowledge behind the fight itself, which really dictates the success of a tank. So Nords, however, are definitely one of the strongest races. They get 2,000 health, 1,000 stamina, they get 3960 additional spell and physical resistance, so you get to invest a bit less into overall resistances this way. Then you also get some additional ultimate back whenever you take damage. It really ties into the Sorc advantage of having that cheaper Warhorn cost to get more major force uptime. 2 other races that are considered to be kind of the top tier for tanking are going to be the Imperials and the Argonians. So Imperials get 2,000 max health and 2,000 max stamina. They get a 3% cost reduction to all abilities, and they get 333 health, stamina, and magicka back whenever they deal damage every 5 seconds. So quite a bit of additional sustain through the Imperials that is not present on the Nords. You also get much more raw stats compared to the Nords, but they don't get any sort of additional ultimate generation. So in terms of sustain, Imperials are going to be better than Nords, but in terms of ultimate generation, Nords are going to be stronger than Imperials. Then you have the Argonians. So the Argonians get 1,000 max health and 1,000 max magicka, so quite a few Resource-wise, it's going to be behind the other two races, Nords and Imperials. They do get 4,000 health, magic, and stamina back whenever they drink any potion in the game, so they get really strong sustain that way, particularly when you combine it with potion cooldown glyphs. And they also get, I believe, 7 or 8% additional healing done, so your self heals are also going to be a little bit stronger as an Argonian. But it's really that potion passive that really makes Argonians shine as tanks. In terms of attributes, your attribute distribution is going to be different depending on your race. So for example, I'm a Nord, so this is kind of the distribution that I have. So I have 20 health, 20 stamina, 24 magicka. But depending on your race, you might end up going with different distributions. So for example, if you decide to go with a Dark Elf, Dark Elves don't get any points, any sort of additional racial passives into their max health, but they do get some additional racial passives to max stamina and max magicka. That allows you to invest a little bit less into stamina and magicka and dump more points into health. So it is going to vary quite a bit depending on your specific race. General rule of thumb is to get around 35k max health as a minimum, and then try to get over 20k magicka and stamina, and always make sure your stamina is higher than your magicka. Those are kind of the rules that you kind of want to hit no matter what race you are. For Mundus, we're going with the Atronach to get our magicka regen up. Just want to make sure to have good magicka regen because a lot of your buffs and self-heal does use magicka, so you just don't want to run out of magicka that way. Using Tri-Stat food, this is purple food, which gives us max health, max magicka, and max stamina. And then you are a vampire. So at stage 3 vampire, like we have here, we get access to the Undeath passive, which is some additional damage mitigation when you're below 50% health. At stage 2 vampirism, we also get 10% additional magicka and stamina regen. But the kind of downside of being a vampire is your health regen does take a hit, and you do take more damage from fire. So just keep that in mind if you want to be a vampire or not. If you are able to stay without being a vampire and you don't want to be a vampire, you don't have to be one. But most endgame tanks do like to be vampires for the Undeath passive as well as the additional magicka regen. Moving on to our skill bars. This is the front bar, so this is the sword and board bar. You have Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, Empowered Ward, Unstable Clannfear, Bound Armaments, and Absorption Field. So arguably the Clannfear is going to be a flex spot here, depends on whether you want to use Dark Deal as your self-heal or not. This is a really strong self-heal for yourself, so kind of depends on whether you want a very strong self-heal that's reliable, or you just want to rely on Dark Deal instead. For our back bar, this is the Ice Staff bar, or your bow bar. We have Inner Rage, Blockade of Frost, Dark Deal. You have the double bar, Unstable Clannfear. Shadow Silk, this is a flex spot, and then we have Aggressive Warhorn. On the front bar here, there really aren't that many flex spots. You want the ward for your shield, you have Unstable Clannfear as a self-heal, but you can take this out if you would like, if you want to depend on Dark Deal as your self-heal here. There are some big disadvantages of running Dark Deal, which is mainly the fact that it has a cast time. So if you can play around with the cast time and you know the fight well enough to know when to use Dark Deal, then by all means you can use this as a self-heal, but it is much less of an on-demand self-heal than Unstable Clannfear. So just keep that in mind if you decide to go that route and forego the Unstable Clannfear or Dark Deal instead as your self-heal. Now you do have a couple of other options when it comes to your flex spots here. So starting off under our class abilities, not too much here to play around with. Restraining Prison, if you need a hard CC, it also gives you Major Vitality as well. So if you want a native source of Major Vitality, you can definitely run this, even if it doesn't necessarily immobilize bosses, you still get the Major Vitality, so you get 2 seconds of Major Vitality, I should say 3 seconds of Major Vitality if you're running Restraining Prison, even on boss fights. But this is more for trash for this hard CC. Under the summoning line, not much here besides the Matriarch, which does heal you, but it's not going to be quite as much as compared to the Unstable Clannfear. It also doesn't necessarily heal you, it heals the Matriarch and up to 2 other people, so it doesn't necessarily need to be you either. So if you want to self-heal, Unstable Clannfear is going to be the best option. And under Storm Calling, you can go with Boundless Storm or Hurricane. Doesn't really matter which one you go for. They both give you Major Ward and Major Resolve. Boundless Storm will give you Major Expedition for 4 seconds, but Hurricane will give you Minor Expedition for pretty much the entire duration. So it depends on whether you want faster, a much bigger movement buff for a shorter period of time, or a much smaller movement buff for a much longer period of time. Boundless Storm also uses Magicka compared to Hurricane's Stamina, so it really depends on how you feel about your stamina sustain. And then you have Liquid Lightning here for the additional synergy if you want to help give your off tank additional synergy for Alkosh uptime or your DPS for Lakesti's uptime. Moving on to Sword and Boar Bar, you can use Absorbent Magic if you are dealing with something that uses spell projectiles for an additional self-heal. It also has a couple of additional block passive boosts there as well. Running a bow back bar instead of Blockade, you'll be running Endless Hail to help proc your enchants. And then you could also want to get Elemental Drain as well. Typically speaking, your healers will be running this, but if you're running something like 1 tank, 3 DPS, and 4-man content, DPS might not have Elemental Drain, so you might want to pick this up anyways. Under the Fighter's Guild line, you have Circle of Protection for the AoE minor protection, which is pretty nice to have, but it's going to be used only in certain fights where you're going to be stacked up pretty closely because it does have a 5-meter radius. So for example, Assembly General, Lakesti's Hard Mode are good examples of where you might want to have Circular Protection on hand. Balance here, you exchange health for Magicka, so this is more for Magicka Sustain, which is actually going to be quite useful overall. So unfortunately, it's kind of hard to fit in balance in any of your slots, but if you want, you can put this here on the back bar instead of Shadow Silk there. This just helps out Magicka Sustain, so good kind of strategy is to use balance to get your Magicka, and then use Dark Deal to get some of your health back as well as stamina. So you can turn health into Magicka, and then Magicka into stamina using Dark Deal. You can also go the route of running Meditate, either Deep Thoughts or Introspection here for both Magicka and Stamina. So for example, if you want, you can get rid of Unstable Clannfear entirely, replace it with 2 other flexibilities, possibly 1 Boundless Storm or a Hurricane for the Major Ward Major Resolve, and then just run Deep Thoughts or Introspection for your Sustain instead. So that's another option there as well. Under the Undaunted line, pretty much all these abilities are flex spots, so Overflowing Altar for the minor lifesteal as well as the Blood Feast synergy, Shadow Silk for the Black Widow's synergy, Inner Rage is your range taunt, so not really a flex, Bone Surge for the additional shield, the synergy, and the major vitality from that synergy, and then Energy Orb to help give your Combustion synergy out to your DPS. Under the Alliance skill line, you can go with the Vigor, either Morph for a self-heal. It does use Magicka stamina though, so keep that in mind. And then Efficient Purge if you're in a fight where you need some additional purging going on to get rid of any sort of debuffs. You can also run Replenishing Barrier as an ultimate, which does end up activating your Magicka 8 passive for additional Magicka regen. Moving on to our champion points, the CP cap is still 810, which gives us 270 points across each of our 3 different constellation types. Starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanist, 49 into Tenacity, then we have 66 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 40 Warlord. You can play around with the green CPs as you see fit. The idea is to get at least 61 points into Shadow Ward for the cost reduction in block. For our blue CPs, only 2 nodes matter if you're just a raw tank, Blessed and Elfborn. So you want to get these all the way up to 100, and then from there you have 70 points. You can really place wherever you'd like. Generally speaking, you want to get that additional crit chance with Perfect Strike, so you want at least 30 points into the ritual, but beyond that you can put the remaining 40 points wherever you'd like. These nodes are mostly centered around DPS, so again, doesn't really matter where you put them. Red CPs here, I have a one-size-fits-most approach, so this is going to give you pretty decent mitigation, but it's not going to necessarily maximize or optimize mitigation for any single piece of content in the game. So you will need to move some red CP points around depending on the trial that you're running. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 in both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that's pretty much all the build information, so now we can go ahead and talk about the philosophy of tanking. So tanking in ESO is a little bit different compared to other MMOs. In some other MMOs, tanking is seen mostly as a damage sponge sort of role. So you're just there to take the hits, and you're not supposed to deal hits back, you're not really supposed to heal anybody. Some MMOs you are also sort of an off heals, but ESO kind of adds in a little bit more involvement when it comes to your tanking role. So yes, you're still primarily going to be a damage sponge. You're still, want to make sure you stay alive. You still want to make sure to have taunt. You're going to be the one getting wailed on by the boss. But outside of that, you also want to make sure to buff your friends and debuff your enemies. That's really what support roles are all about in this game. It's more about buffing DPS and debuffing enemies to help improve your group DPS than it is just being a raw, basically target dummy for the boss enemy. So a lot of that utility comes from your skills as well as your sets. So for example, Dark Deal not only provides some additional sustain with the additional stamina, but because it is a dark magic ability, whenever we use Dark Deal, we also end up giving out Minor Prophecy via the Exploitation passive whenever we cast it. And the good thing about it is because they both last for 20 seconds, once Dark Deal is over, you have to recast it to get that Minor Prophecy back to the group. Another example of abilities that provide good DPS utility would be, for example, on the Undaunted line, Shadow Silk and Energy Orb. Shadow Silk, the Black Widow synergy, is still pretty strong, and then Energy Orbs give some additional magicka or stamina back, helping out DPS sustain so they can fulfill their light attack rotation for a little bit longer. And of course, there are some other utilities that are not necessarily DPS oriented. So for example, Overflowing Altar gives you minor lifesteal, which helps out your healers a little bit by giving a little bit of additional trickling heal that goes on every second. And you also have that Blood Feast synergy, which heals for a percentage of a person's max health. So it's a really strong healing synergy to have on hand as well. And of course, your sets also contribute to both DPS and sometimes groups of ability as well. Ebon provides both by allowing DPS to spec more into damage and also providing some additional health for survivability. And Claw of Yolnahkriin, for example, provides minor courage, which helps directly boost weapon and spell damage that way. In terms of playing a Sorc tank, there aren't that many things to really kind of pay attention to. Obviously you want to use your Clannfear as your burst self-heal. It is percentage based, so keep that in mind. It's not necessarily going to scale off of your magicka, it just scales off the percentage of your max health. Now Sorc tanks in general, like I mentioned, do have stronger block mitigation, and that's because of Bound Armaments, which increases your block mitigation by 36% for 3 seconds once you activate it. So if you know a big hit is coming, you can just use Bound Armaments here. You get that 3 seconds of additional block mitigation, which is really strong for overall survivability. It's probably second only to maybe the Grim Focus on Nightblade tanks there in terms of raw mitigation. Your shield's not particularly strong because it scales off from max magicka, but it's still fairly respectable here. So you can see here that your Empowered Ward here gives us an 8643 shield out of 39k health or so, which ends up being just around 21%, 22% of our overall health, I believe. It's like a 22-ish % health shield, which is not a little bit stronger than like Igneous Shield or Fragmented Shield, but overall not particularly strong. But you're not really relying on your shield necessarily to survive. You're relying more on your strong burst heal from your Clannfear, as well as your block mitigation from Bound Armaments. Outside of that, just make sure to keep up Blockade or Endless Hail, depending on whether you're using a staff or a bow backbar to help your enchant. Make sure your enchant is proc. Now, the one really big thing you want to be really aware of as a Sorc tank is the fact that Dark Deal does have a cast time associated with it. So when you hit it, you basically have about 1.5 seconds where you're vulnerable and you can't block while you are casting this, otherwise you lose the cast. So for example, if I were to block right here, well, I just don't get my resources back. So be very mindful of when you use Dark Deal. The best time to use it would be probably right after a boss's heavy attack, but it really depends on your knowledge of the fight to know when is the best time to use Dark Deal. But once you master that and can use Dark Deal reliably, it's actually a very strong resource return. It gives back 3600 stamina right away, and then it provides an additional 2400 stamina over 20 seconds, which ends up working out to be 240 stamina per second, basically the equivalent of restoring focus on a Templar tank. So pretty nice overall, and it does restore stamina while you're blocking as well, so don't necessarily have to worry about your stamina sustain necessarily as a tank, as long as you're able to cast that Dark Deal. It's a little bit hard to kind of describe tanking without actually showing you guys how to tank. Unfortunately, I do not know any Sorc tanks that tanks vet trials off the top of my head. And if I do hear of any streamers, or you guys know of any streamers, let me know and I'll leave their stream information in the description below. But if you guys have any questions about the builds, just leave a comment below and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. I don't really play Sorc tank. I don't have a Sorc tank on live, so I'll try to find an answer for you guys for somebody who does play a Sorc tank, or if you have just questions in general about just tanking in general, I can't answer those sort of tanking in general questions. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.